The internationally important vegetation types of northeast England. Welcome to this presentation for the Natural History Society of Northumbria on the topic in the title above. My name is Dr. Dave Mitchell, a plant ecologist in Natural England's regional team based in Newcastle upon Tyne. A modified version of this presentation has also been devised with menus and hyperlinks for use outdoors on a smartphone, tablet or laptop, and can be made available to the Society upon request. The context of this presentation is that we're very lucky in the northeast of England. We're blessed with a diverse assemblage of internationally important coastal, lowland and upland vegetation types. The aim of this presentation is to try to provide a concise pictorial introduction to what the northeast internationally important habitats look like, their ecology, management, and the key indicator species to look out for on field trips. I guess we need to, at this stage, ask ourselves, why are these habitats of international importance? The European Habitats Directive 1992 lists Annex 1 and Annex 1 priority habitats, which are those considered to be most in need of conservation at a European level. The UK and the other countries have selected a network of sites called Special Areas of Conservation, abbreviated to SACs, with the best examples of these habitats. Some of these habitats are geographically very restricted in Europe, such that the UK supports the main examples, for example, blanket bog, as shown in the picture below. Other Annex 1 habitats are rare, vulnerable or endangered due to changing environmental and management factors in the landscape. A good example would be mountain hay meadows. This presentation attempts to relate the region's qualifying SAC Annex 1 habitats to vegetation types described in the British National Vegetation Classification, abbreviated to NVC. The map on screen attempts to show the spatial distribution of our internationally important habitats in the northeast of England. These occur within upland, coastal and lowland SAC sites, and these cover approximately 10% of the region, as shown in the purple hatched areas on the map. Large areas of our uplands, for example the North Pennines, are covered by this designation,
as are large areas of the Northumberland coast. And then there is a suite of smaller sites in our lowland areas. I should just take the opportunity at this point to clarify that Annex 1 habitats are not just restricted to the sites shown on the map. They do occur outside of the special areas of conservation across the wider landscape as well. The Annex 1 habitats can be linked to either groups or individual vegetation types as described in the 5 volumes of the British National Vegetation Classification. And the table in blue in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen summarizes the 5 major vegetation formations that are included in the 5 NVC volumes. And for the rest of the talk, my intention is to work through these major vegetation formations in sequence and illustrate and describe the Annex 1 European qualifying habitat features. So the first major vegetation formation are our woodlands and scrub vegetation types. Our first SAC Annex 1 qualifying habitat are described as Taxus baccata woods of the British Isles. And they relate directly to NVC type W13. Good examples of this vegetation, known as Taxus baccata woodland or U woodland, can be found in Castle Eden Dean SAC and some of the other coastal ravine areas of East County Durham, and also some scattered sites elsewhere in the northeast. This woodland is rare in the northeast and is a type of vegetation that is at its extreme northern limit in the UK in our region. Yew woodland occurs as patches on steep rocky slopes, cliffs, and in ravines on the Carboniferous and Permian limestones of northern England. The trees themselves can live for over 1,000 years, and over this time they can shade out scrub species and outlive any faster growing deciduous trees to form distinctive patches of yew. These yew patches are managed within larger areas of mixed woodlands, such as ash woodlands. And this is what we see at Castle Eden Dean, SAC, near Peterlee in County Durham. Our next SAC Annex 1 qualifying habitat are described as juniperous communus formations on heaths or calcareous soils. And these are synonymous with W19 in the NVC, which is labelled as Juniperus communis oxalis acetosella scrub. This is a nice picture of this habitat in Upper Teesdale, and you can see good examples of the different growth forms of juniper in the foreground, prostrate examples on the left and upright forms on the right. Growing under the juniper, we quite often have wood sorrel. This again is a rare habitat in the northeast of England. Juniper was actually one of the first woody species to colonize Britain after the last glaciation about 12,000 years ago. Many stands are isolated and regeneration is very limited. This means that when the bushes exceed the age of about 50 years, their fruits become increasingly sterile. Juniper regeneration has been affected by diseases and the grazing of young seedlings. Consequently, replanting schemes have therefore been undertaken to help conserve the populations. Good examples of this work can be seen in the Moor House to Upper Teesdale SAC. Moving on to our second major vegetation formation, our Myres and Heaths. We start with a widespread habitat in the northeast region. This is an SAC Annex 1 qualifying habitat labelled as blanket bogs. And if these blanket bogs are active or capable of being active, i.e. peat forming, then they are classed as a priority feature. This means that they are recognised as deserving extra special conservation measures. Blanket bog is widespread in the northeast region, but is of very limited distribution in Europe. Classic species to look out for in the field include hare's tail cotton grass, growing often with heather, and an understory of red sphagnum mosses. These are sometimes accompanied by feather mosses, and drier areas of bogs occasionally have cloudberry. The picture on screen shows a typical example from the Pennines and shows bog pools and the typical hummock hollow terrain that forms on our blanket bogs. This particular blanket bog relates to one of the NVC types listed in the table, M19. This is known as Columnar Vulgaris Eriophorum vaginatum blanket mire, basically a combination of heather and hare's tail cotton grass with an assemblage of species as shown on the slide. Blanket bog forms when dead matter, mainly sphagnum mosses and cotton grasses, accumulates to form peat in a near permanently waterlogged state. They are maintained entirely by precipitation in cool climates. Many modified forms occur on deeper peats due to land use activities such as forestry, drainage works, burning for grouse mower management, for example, and sheep grazing management. Such modified bogs can quite often look like heathland or grassland. These modified forms are potentially restorable to active blanket bog with appropriate management. Therefore, extensive restoration works have been instigated. This includes things like grip blocking, the cessation of burning, lower intensity grazing, and tree removal. These are all intended to conserve the scientific importance of our internationally important blanket bogs. Our next habitat is essentially the lowland cousin of our blanket bogs, and the SAC Annex 1 qualifying habitat is known as active raised bogs, which again are classed as a priority feature. A range of NVC types can be found within this Annex 1 habitat, for example, M2, M18, M19. The example in the slide shows M18, which is Erica tetralix sphagnum papillosum raised and blanket mire. The inset photograph shows a landscape view of Ford Moss SAC in Northumberland, one of the very best examples of active raised bog in our region. Again, typical structure of the bog is bog pools and then hummock and hollow terrain with different species of plants. Typical species include a range of sphagnum mosses, some brown, some red and chunky, and some green. Growing with the sphagnum mosses, insectivorous plants such as sundews. The yellow plants in the main picture are bog asphodel. There's also little pink cross-leaved heath plants, cranberry, and bog rosemary. This habitat is rare in the northeast of England with just a small handful of sites. Some very similar sort of habitats occur in the Kielder Myers or the Border Myers, Kielder to Butterburn SAC, and they occur in transitions with blanket bog. Like blanket bogs, active raised bogs are peat-forming ecosystems where the depth of peat, often in a raised dome, isolates them from the influence of groundwater. The edge of such bogs often slope into mire vegetation known as the lag. This is often more alkaline than the raised bog and shows greater species diversity with a preponderance of sedge species. The annotations on the picture at the bottom of the slide attempt to show the spatial distribution of the raised mire and the lag area, for example, at Ford Moss SAC. Sites such as Ford Moss have been affected by tree invasion and other factors, and these have been subject to restoration management. So there have been works conducted to remove tree saplings. There has been the installation of grip blocking to restore the hydrology of the bog, and similar works have taken place in the Border Myers, Kielder to Butterburn SAC as well. Our next SAC Annex 1 qualifying habitat is the transition mires and quaking bogs, which again include a range of NVC types. To illustrate this vegetation, I've picked M9 in the NVC, which is known as Carex rostrata, Calliogonella cuspidata, Calliogon giganteum mire. This habitat occurs in the Border Myers, Kielder to Butterburn SAC. Typical species include bottle sedge or common sedge, and growing under the sedges, we often find a range of spear mosses with pointed leaves and sometimes with a red stem. Transition mires are transitional between various acid bog and alkaline fen vegetation types. They often occupy a physically transitional location, for example, on the marginal lag of raised bogs or on the edge of a blanket bog. They can be vulnerable to various threats, such as afforestation and drainage works. Forest plans have therefore been designed to avoid tree planting in such sensitive areas. Many of these systems are very unstable underfoot and can therefore also be described as quaking bogs. The next SAC Annex 1 qualifying habitat is known as alkaline fens and includes several NVC types. The main one being M10, Carex dioica pinguicula vulgaris Meyer. There is a similar SAC Annex 1 habitat, Alpine pioneer formations, which is very similar in appearance, but includes a few more Arctic alpine species. The main picture shows typical species associated with these Annex 1 habitat types. This includes plants such as the bird's eye primrose, dioecious sedge, carnation sedge, yellow saxifrage, and a range of brown mosses on the ground. Alkaline fens and alpine pioneer formations develop on calcareous surface water glaze and stony soils, which receive continuous irrigation by base-rich waters. They are maintained by livestock grazing and the trampling caused by livestock, natural flushing waters, scouring and freeze-thaw action. In such hostile conditions, they are thought to be similar to the early post-glacial vegetation that colonized the tundra-like landscape as the ice caps melted. In the Moorhouse Upper Teesdale SAC, they support populations of rare montane and Arctic alpine species, such as bird's eye primrose, false sedge, hair sedge, Scottish asphodel, and Teesdale sandwort, the latter at its only British location. Closely related to the previous Annex 1 habitats is another SAC Annex 1 qualifying habitat known as Petrifying Springs with tufa formation. This again includes several NVC types, the main one being M37, Palustriella commutata, Festuca rubra spring. So this is a typical photograph showing these little green areas spangling a hillside with water flushing through the slope and the vegetation being dominated by a range of mosses, particularly hook mosses, as shown in the top photograph. And the photograph actually shows tufa formation in amongst the moss. These habitats occur where the ground is permanently moist through the irrigation with base-rich calcareous and nutrient-poor waters. As we've seen on the previous slide, deposition of crunchy tufa, calcium carbonate, sometimes occurs in the mosses and on the rocks. They usually occur on sloping ground as spring heads, seepage lines, and sometimes on vertical rock faces. The open nature of the vegetation and the dominance of the moss carpet may be maintained by grazing and light poaching by livestock. A particularly rare SAC Annex 1 habitat in our region are our Millennium Meadows on calcareous, peaty or clay silt-laden soils. This is synonymous with M26 in the NVC, and good examples can be found in the Moorhouse Upper Teesdale SAC. M26 in the British NVC is labelled Millennia Caerulea Crepus pallidosa Meyer. The main photograph shows an example of this habitat in Upper Teesdale and shows a sward of purple moor grass with sharp flowered rush and an understory of plants. This includes butterfly orchid, self-heal and marsh hawksbeard. Millennium Meadows are species-rich purple moor grassland types occurring on well-aerated soils and peats that are kept wet by moving water. They are very rare in the northeast of England and occur on slopes flushed with base-rich waters and are maintained by livestock grazing. They should not be confused with the more widespread species-poor purple moor grass dominant vegetation, which in the NVC is labelled as M25. These are often derived from drainage or frequent burning and grazing of blanket bog or wet heath habitats. Wet heath habitats are also classed as a SAC Annex 1 qualifying habitat and are labelled as Northern Atlantic wet heath with Erica tetralix. The main NVC type is M15, Trichophorum cespitosum, Erica tetralix wet heath. Typical species include heather, often growing with cross-leaved heath, and deer grass. Our wet heaths usually occupy shallow peats and mineral soils that are waterlogged for part of the year, but are actually too dry or too shallow for very active peat formation, as occurs in blanket bogs. Dry heath plants tend to be absent or are of reduced vigour due to their inability to tolerate high concentrations of reduced ferrous iron in the waterlogged soils. Burning, drainage, overgrazing and forestry management activities can result in less species diversity. So, for example, where wet heaths are often modified into species-poor purple moor grass vegetation types through burning, grazing and other activities. Related to the wet heaths is the next SAC Annex 1 qualifying habitat, European dry heaths. This includes a range of NVC types as listed in the table. The main photograph shows a good example of H12, one of the more widespread European dry heath types, and this is known in the NVC as Columnar vulgaris Vaccinium Myrtleus heath. Typical species include heather and bilberry, often with an understory of feather mosses and cladonia lichens. Closely related to European dry heaths is another SAC Annex 1 qualifying habitat, Alpine and Boreal heaths. These tend to occur at higher altitudes in very exposed situations, and some wind-clipped subalpine forms of the NVC types shown in the table may be transitional to such alpine and boreal heaths. Such heaths are dominated by stands of dwarf ericaceous shrubs and grow on thin peat or podzolized acidic mineral soils that are well drained but kept moist by rain, mist and snow. They are usually secondary vegetation. That means they are a modified form of the understory of woodlands that were cleared by people from the Neolithic period onwards. Current grazing levels prevent succession back to woodland, and grouse moor management activities use rotational burning in small patches to create a patchwork of different age states of heather. Moving on to our third major vegetation formation, our grasslands and montane communities. The first SAC Annex 1 qualifying habitat is our semi-natural dry grassland and scrubland facies on calcareous substrates. These occur in both upland and lowland situations, and the relevant NVC types are listed in the table. For the purposes of the presentation, I've selected CG9 in the NVC, which is labelled as Sesleria caerulea Gallium sterneri grassland. These are our upland blue moor grass, calcareous grasslands, and usually associated with the blue moor grass, we find limestone bedstraw. The photograph on the slide is taken next to the reservoir in Upper Teesdale. Our semi-natural calcareous grasslands occur on thin, calcium-rich Renzina soils with a neutral to basic pH. The soils are prone to summer drought and are poor in available phosphate and minerals. These are locked up by the calcium and therefore rendered unavailable to the roots of plants. These habitats are maintained by livestock grazing, but in some lowland situations, such grazing has been sporadic and scrub invasion has occurred. Invading scrub has been cleared at some sites, but others remain threatened and vulnerable. A sadly very rare habitat now in northeast England is our next SAC Annex 1 qualifying habitat, our mountain hay meadows. The main NVC type for this Annex 1 vegetation is MG3, Anthoxanthum odoratum geranium sylvaticum grassland. And the picture shows quite a rare site these days, a species-rich hay meadow in the Pennines. Typical species include the wood cranesbill, often grown in association with pignut, and a range of other tall herbs such as melancholy thistle, great burnet, and globe flower. Mountain hay meadows are probably derived from the post-glacial tall herb flora that once survived in open mixed ash woodland glades. Such habitats can also include wet grassland vegetation with abundant marsh marigold. Hay meadows evolved as in-by land associated with farmsteads, but examples also occur on roadside verges and riverbanks. The flora has been shaped by haymaking and its associated practices of grazing, both of which remove the more coarse, robust species that would engulf the finer and smaller species. Occasional liming, which offsets the gradual leaching and acidification of the soils, and light manuring of the sward to offset the loss of nutrients. Good examples of mountain hay meadows are almost extinct now in the northeast of England due to the decline of the above traditional farming practices. Our next SAC Annex 1 qualifying habitats in this section of the presentation are silicous scree of the montane to snow levels and the closely related silicous rocky slopes with chasmophytic vegetation. Both of these Annex 1 types correlate to U21 in the British NVC, and examples of this vegetation are quite rare in the northeast. Good examples being located in the Moorhouse to Upper Teesdale SAC and the North Pennines SAC. U21 is labelled as Cryptogramma crispa Descampsia flexuosa community. And the key species are shown in the main picture. So in the foreground, we have a colony of parsley fern growing within a sward of wavy hairgrass. And the community extends up the scree slopes in the background of the picture and towards the rocky cliffs. This is pioneer vegetation of scree and boulders of hard, acidic and weathered rocks. Pockets of soil and nutrients derived from wind-blown detritus collects in crevices and provides niches for chasmophytes. These are crevice-dwelling species. Natural rock movements help to maintain this pioneer stage of vegetation. This is because these rock movements prevent the development of closed acidic grasslands, heathlands, bracken or woodland in the relative absence of livestock grazing, and this stops larger plants from smothering the small ferns and grasses. Moving on to our fourth major vegetation formation, our aquatic communities, swamps and tall herb fens. Our first SAC Annex 1 qualifying habitat are the watercourses of plain to montane levels with various water crowfoots. Typical NVC types are A17 and A18, The example in the photograph shows a 17 Ranunculus penicillatus community as recognized in the National Vegetation Classification. This is chalk stream water crowfoot. Typical examples of this community occur in the River Tweed SAC in the very north of our region. The next SAC Annex 1 qualifying habitat are our hard oligo-mesotrophic waters with benthic vegetation of Chara species. This can include a range of NVC types. I've selected A22 from the NVC Littorella uniflora lobelia dortmanna community. This is taken at Tarn Dub in the Moorhouse Upper Teesdale SAC and shows an example of shoreweed growing with submerged stonewort species. We don't have many tarns in the northeast of England, so not surprisingly, this is a very rare habitat in the northeast of England. Our next SAC Annex 1 qualifying habitat is natural eutrophic lakes with various aquatic macrophyte plants. This covers a range of NVC aquatic communities, and I've just picked out one of those for illustrative purposes, A9 Potamogeton natans community. This is broad-leaved pondweed. Again, we do not have many natural eutrophic lakes in the northeast of England, so this assemblage of vegetation is quite rare in our region. So I've combined some notes on the previous Annex 1 habitat types. Key influencing factors on these aquatic vegetation types include the altitude. This obviously influences the water temperature and the growing season available to plants. The substrate at the bottom of the water body is influential. This affects the stability of the root zone. The shape of the water body can be important, as this can influence the distribution of exposed and sheltered locations for plants with different preferences. And last but not least, the management history of the water body is important. So for example, recreational, industrial or agricultural uses can influence the survival and composition of the vegetation and the constituent species. The natural eutrophic lakes Annex 1 qualifying habitat also includes various swamp communities as recognized in the National Vegetation Classification. I've picked an example of S27, and this is labeled as the Carex rostrata potentilla palustris tall herb fen. The named species are shown in the main photograph. So we have bottle sedge, and growing in amongst the bottle sedge, marsh cinquefoil. Typical examples of this sort of vegetation and the previous aquatic plants can be found at the Roman Wall Lofts SAC. So looking at the swamp and tall herb vegetation within this Annex 1 habitat type, swamps are species-poor vegetation types generally dominated by emergent monocotyledons with little or no understory. In comparison, tall herb fens are characterized by mixtures of emergent monocotyledons with an understory of tall dicotyledons. These communities have different hydrological regimes. So in swamps, the water is above the ground for much of the year, but in the tall herb fens, the water is not above the ground for long periods. Both habitats are transitional and would over time succeed to wet willow, birch, alder and ash woodlands and shrubby carr vegetation. And moving to the fifth and final major vegetation formation, our maritime communities and vegetation of open habitats. Our first SAC Annex 1 qualifying habitat occurs right down on our beaches. And these are our embryonic shifting dunes. Typical NVC types include SD2 and SD4, and I've selected for the main picture examples of SD2 vegetation: Honkinia peploides, Kekili, Maritime strandline community. And this is the vegetation that develops in the rotting seaweed zone at the front of the dunes and includes typical species such as sea sandwort, prickly saltwort, sea holly, sand couch, sea rocket, and various species of orchid. Embryonic shifting dune vegetation occurs in high energy environments where exposure to salt spray, inundation by the sea, storm damage, and drought limit the diversity of plants that can survive. They are pretty hostile environments for plants to live in. These habitats are vulnerable to natural winter storms and the loss of sand materials caused by longshore drift, but they are also damaged by recreational activities. Some management, such as fencing, has occurred in places to reduce the impacts of these recreational activities. Sometimes sand couch forms tiny little dunes behind the strand line, and sand couch itself can withstand occasional immersion in seawater, such that it can build embryo dunes behind the strand line and out of the reach of the tides. Immediately behind the strand line is our next SAC qualifying habitat, shifting dunes along the foreshore with Ammophila arenaria, otherwise known as white dunes. The main NVC type associated with this Annex 1 habitat is SD6, Ammophila arenaria mobile dune community. Quite often, large expanses of dunes are dominated by an almost monoculture of marram grass with large areas of bare sand, as shown in the picture. Marram dunes generally leave lots of sand exposed and are sometimes called white, yellow, mobile or shifting dunes. They are not species rich due to the drought-prone nature of the sands and the instability of that substrate. Marram grass has a vigorous lateral growth that makes it very effective for trapping sand, and it can build dunes in excess of 5 meters high. Shifting dunes are vulnerable to damage caused by recreational activities. Consequently, some management, such as fencing, boardwalks, and signage have taken place in the North Northumberland Dunes SAC at Lindisfarne, for example, in an attempt to reduce these recreational impacts. Then moving slightly further inland, behind the shifting dunes, is our next SAC Annex 1 qualifying habitat. These are our fixed coastal dunes with herbaceous vegetation, sometimes known as grey dunes, and these are a priority feature. They include a range of NVC types, as shown in the table, and for illustrative purposes, I've selected SD8, Festuca rubra, Gallium verum fixed dune grassland. So typical species include fine-leaved red fescue and lady's bedstraw. And you can see in the photograph a range of other species, such as bird's foot trefoil and bloody crane's bill, and of course marram grass. Fixed coastal dunes are characterized by marram grass and a diverse range of other plants, and they usually develop on stabilized substrates which are less drought-prone than mobile dunes. Heavier grazed patches often support short, species-rich swards. In contrast, ungrazed or lightly grazed back dunes often support tall falso grass swards with bloody crane's bill. These taller swards became particularly extensive on the northeast coast after the myxomatosis epidemic in the 1950s, which reduced the grazing impact of rabbits. Within sand dune systems, wet areas develop and a different type of vegetation develops, and this includes two SAC Annex 1 qualifying habitats. Dunes with salix repens and humid dune slacks. These cover a range of NVC types as listed in the table. They are particularly rare in the northeast of England, the main examples being found within the Northumberland Dunes SAC at Rosslinks and Lindisfarne. The main picture attempts to show the two SAC habitats, which often grow in close association with each other. So on the left, the dune with salix repens shows small raised dunes dominated by creeping willow and a range of moss species. And the photograph on the right shows a wet area adjacent to the mini dune with creeping willow and Yorkshire fog. In the NVC, this vegetation is labelled as SD16, Salix repens, Holcus lunatus dune slack community. So these wet areas within the dunes are areas of damp sand which vary in appearance and floristic composition due to a range of factors. This includes the frequency and extent of water table fluctuations. So, for example, some slacks are immersed in water for months and months on end, while some never flood at all and are known as dry slacks. Another factor is the proportion of calcareous shelly material in the sand and water. The age of the habitat is important in relation to the time since the vegetation colonization of bare sand began. The nutrient content of the sand and water also influences the vegetation composition. And last but not least, the type, timing and intensity of grazing management is important. So for example, cattle grazing occurs at Lindisfarne and Rosslinks within the Northumberland Dunes SAC. Our next coastal SAC Annex 1 qualifying habitat is our large shallow inlets and bays. This includes our salt marsh vegetation. This is a slightly different habitat to the other habitats previously discussed. The salt marshes are incorporated into this rather generic large shallow inlets and bays rather than recognizing specific salt marsh Annex 1 types such as Atlantic salt meadows, for example. Salt marshes include a range of NVC types ranging from SM1 to SM28 in the NVC. And for illustrative purposes, I've included a picture of SM13, Puxinalia maritima salt marsh community. So in the foreground, we can see common salt marsh grass, which forms an extensive sward down to the open water. And within this common salt marsh grass sward, we have a range of rubbery-leaved plants, common scurvy grass, sea sperry, sea arrowgrass, sea plantain, thrift, sea milkwort, and sea aster. Such salt marshes are accretional habitats that usually develop in sheltered estuaries, bays and inlets, etc., where silt is deposited and the marsh keeps building over time. Inundation by salty tidal waters means that only strict halophytes can survive in the hostile conditions of the lower and middle zones of the marsh. Adaptations to such hostile conditions include thick rubbery leaves and specialized cells to accumulate and excrete excess salt. Most examples of the northeast salt marshes are not actively managed, for example, by livestock grazing, but some salt marsh restoration schemes have taken place. So, for example, at Warkworth, there's been the removal of an artificial land bridge to allow an area to reflood with tidal waters and to allow salt marsh to re-establish in the area. And our last coastal habitat is the vegetated sea cliffs of the Atlantic and Baltic coasts. This includes maritime cliff vegetation, but also includes a wide range of other vegetation types such as scrub, grassland, fen, flush, and so on. For illustrative purposes, I've chosen MC11 in the NVC, the Festuca rubra Dorcas carota maritime grassland, which is typical of the magnesian limestone sea cliffs in County Durham, which is notified as an SAC, the Durham Coast SAC. And the picture shows a nice example of a red fescue sward interspersed with the white flower heads of wild carrot. Vegetated sea cliffs can include distinct zones, including the maritime zone, where sea cliff vegetation occurs with abundant halophytes, with thick rubbery leaves, similar to those we saw in salt marshes. In such environments, there's a strong and direct influence of sea spray, and such adaptations help the plants to survive. Away from the sea spray zone, we have the paramaritime sea cliff vegetation zone, where the special climatic conditions of the coast are influential, but the soils are not saline. Consequently, halophytes are generally absent and more inland vegetation develops. Sea cliff vegetation can be influenced by adjacent land management activities. So, for example, fertilizers on the arable crops on cliff tops can run onto the sensitive sea cliff flora. So the Turning the Tide project on the Durham coast acquired such farmland and converted it into clifftop grassland to stop fertilizers running onto the sensitive vegetation. We're now moving towards the end of the presentation, and there are a couple of SAC qualifying habitats remaining, and these are associated with open habitats. The first are calcareous rocky slopes with chasmophytic vegetation. In the NVC, these include OV39 and OV40, and good examples can be found in the Moorhouse Upper Teesdale SAC. The main picture shows an example of OV40, Asplenium viride, Cystopterus fragilis community. And this essentially is a rocky habitat which provides niches for small ferns such as green spleenwort and brittle bladder fern. Such plants are often characterized by an ability to survive in hostile environments where there's a lack of nutrients and periods of drought. Adaptations include dissected leaves to reduce water loss and wind dispersed spores, which are able to colonize available nutrient pockets. And this explains why ferns are so prevalent in such habitats. Another adaptation is the ability to survive in crevices with nutrients. And this includes plants known as chasmophytes. And a third adaptation is the ability to rehydrate after desiccation, such as our mosses growing on the rocks, for example. These vegetation types often survive as isolated refugia from grazing activities and are completely unmanaged. And our last SAC Annex 1 qualifying habitat are our Culinarian Grasslands. Typical examples can be found in the Tyne and River Allen Gravels SAC. And the main vegetation type is recognised in the NVC as OV37, Festuca ovina minuatia verna community. The photographs show an example on the left on an old mineral spoil heap, and on the right occurring on mineral deposits by a river in the North Pennines. Typical species include red fescue, mountain pansy, Alpine scurvy grass, Alpine pennycress, spring sandwort, and wild thyme. Culinarian grasslands occur on spoil heaps or riverside deposits, which are characterized by high levels of heavy metals released during historic mining activities. The plants have evolved an ability to confine toxins to root cell walls so that they never reach the sensitive leaves of flowers. Over a period of time, the soils become leached by rainfall and the special toxin-tolerant species disappear. Consequently, active management, such as scrub clearance or the disturbance of the surface deposits of some of the older leach sites, has taken place in an attempt to restore the open vegetation. So this concludes the presentation on the internationally important vegetation types of Northeast England, and I hope that this presentation has met the initial aim to provide a concise pictorial introduction to what the Annex 1 habitats of Northeast England look like, their ecology, management, and the key indicator species to look out for on field trips. I hope the Society has enjoyed this presentation and wish to thank the Society for asking me to present this. Thank you very much.